We have many important responsibilities as U.S. Senators. We often have to make very difficult decisions, and deciding to vote against cloture and confirmation for Judge Gorsuch has been a tough decision. Since coming to the Senate, I've been a strong advocate for reforming the rules, to curb abuses, to ensure the body can function, and to make sure that the President's nominees are treated fairly. I believe our constitutional duty to provide advice and consent is one of the most important of all of our responsibilities as U.S. Senators, especially for nominees to our nation's highest court. And I believe withholding consent should be rare, but not unheard of. Sometimes circumstances will be so extraordinary that filibustering a Supreme Court nominee is necessary. The Gang of 14 knew this. That was the group of 14 senators who forged a compromise in 2005. 3 of them are still in the United States Senate. Their agreement allowed some controversial judicial nominees to be confirmed to appellate courts, but it also allowed the Senate to avoid triggering the nuclear option. And it addressed how they would weigh future nominations. The Gang of 14 agreed to the following, and I quote here: "Nominees should be filibustered only under extraordinary circumstances, and each signatory must use his or her own discretion and judgment in determining whether such circumstances exist." End quote. I think that's a good standard, to only filibuster a nominee under extraordinary circumstances. Unfortunately, in my evaluation of Judge Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court, I can't think of more extraordinary circumstances. First, this wasn't President Trump's seat to fill. Justice Scalia died on February 13th, 2016. President Obama still had nearly 1 year at that point to serve in his term. And so President Obama fulfilled his constitutional duty. He nominated one of the most qualified nominees in the history of the court, Judge Merrick Garland. Shortly before Judge Garland was nominated, Senator Hatch, one of our most respected Republican colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, said Judge Garland would be a great pick. Senator Hatch went on to say that President Obama, quote, "probably won't do that because this appointment is about the election," end quote. But President Obama did do it. Judge Garland is not just a fine jurist, he's an exceptional human being. Judge Garland's lifelong commitment to public service is well known. He deserved far better treatment by the Senate majority. Judge Garland was denied a hearing. Many of my Republican colleagues wouldn't even give him the courtesy of a meeting. He never got a vote, which was a disgrace. And it is an injustice that needs to be remedied before I could ever consider voting for Judge Gorsuch. President Trump could fix this. He could make a commitment to nominate Judge Garland to the next vacant seat on the court. It would be the right thing to do. I've been very open that I believe the Senate has become dysfunctional. But what the majority did last year was unprecedented. Things went from bad to rock bottom. Being senatorial used to mean something. The Republican majority has shattered that tradition for purely partisan reasons. In fact, the majority leader has publicly stated, and I quote in full, quote, "One of my proudest moments was when I told Obama, 'You will not fill this Supreme Court vacancy,' end quote." That is a violation of the U.S. Constitution's requirement that the Senate provide advice and consent. And now in 2017, Senator McConnell has guaranteed Judge Gorsuch's confirmation even before he had his hearing. For him, the outcome has been a foregone conclusion. So we see there is no advice and consent now either, just the exercise of power to block a nominee from another party. But President Trump could help heal that deeply partisan wound inflicted by his party. There is still time for both sides to come together and work out an agreement, put bipartisanship and fairness first, and put aside the bitter partisan fighting that has divided the Congress and our nation. Mr. President, there's also a pragmatic reason for President Trump to appoint Judge Garland to the next seat. President Trump needs to ask himself, does he want to be subject to the McConnell precedent? Is he willing to accept that he only gets to appoint justices for 3 years? If a Supreme Court vacancy occurs in 2020, does President Trump understand it is not his vacancy to fill? That's the absurd standard that Leader McConnell has established. If the Republican majority is dead set on changing the rules to jam this nominee through after all that has happened, then we need to talk about this. Perhaps the best thing to do in order to ensure the President understands the gravity of the Republicans' obstruction of his predecessor is to go ahead and put the McConnell rule in place for President Trump. Let's establish in our rules that President Trump only gets 3 years to appoint justices. We could do this with a simple standing order. If the majority leader believed President Obama should only have 3 years to appoint justices, certainly the same standard must apply to President Trump. If the Republican majority thought that their policy in 2016 was good for President Obama, it should be good for President Trump. What's fair is fair. I have a standing order drafted that would do that, and I hope an agreement can be reached to rectify the injustice that was done to Judge Garland, and I hope that Republicans will decide against using the nuclear option. But if that doesn't happen, I will call on the Senate to adopt this standing order so that President Trump is bound by the same restrictions as President Obama. If we are going to change the rules tomorrow, then let's get the Republican majority on record. Are they prepared to hold President Trump to the same unjust standard as President Obama? We can find out. Mr. President, I would also ask unanimous consent to include the text of my standing order in the record at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, Judge Garland's unacceptable treatment isn't the only concern that guides my decision to vote against Judge Gorsuch. Like many things with the Trump administration, there is no shortage of extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps the most serious is the cloud of suspicion over his presidency. U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded that the Russian government interfered in the U.S. presidential election and that it interfered to help candidate Trump. There are unexplained ties between the president, his campaign staff, his associates, and Russian officials. People close to the president had meetings and telephone calls with Russian officials during the campaign and the transition. And most critically, that the FBI and Department of Justice are investigating whether the president and his associates coordinated or conspired with the Russian government to interfere with the presidential election. And an investigation that began last July is likely to continue for months. If the president or his close advisors worked with Russia to help him win the U.S. election, do we really want to let him appoint a justice to the Supreme Court, someone who could be on the court for 30 years or more? There's no reason to rush this nomination. Remember, Republicans had no problem letting Judge Garland's appointment languish for 293 days. And President Obama wasn't under investigation. Judge Gorsuch was nominated just 64 days ago. If Republicans had treated Judge Garland's nomination with the same expediency, he would have been confirmed last May when President Obama still had 8 months in office. The unacceptable treatment of Judge Garland and the investigation into Russia's influence on the election are reasons enough to vote against Judge Gorsuch. But there's one more critical issue, the nominee himself. I have met with Judge Gorsuch. I have followed the hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee. I carefully studied his record, and based on all of this information, I can't support his confirmation. The Supreme Court changes people's lives. Its decisions stand for generations. It is essential that justices understand not only how these issues impact our democracy, but how they affect people's lives, and that they consider them free of ideology. Our meeting and the Senate hearings were Judge Gorsuch's opportunity to convince me that he will be an independent mind on the court. He failed to answer questions that are critical for me. His position on the rights of working mothers, whether women can choose their own health care decisions, LGBTQ rights, and dark money in our elections, just to name a few. But what I found most troubling is he failed to convince me that he would be an independent voice on the court. In just the last couple of months, the President has taken constitutionally questionable actions affecting Muslim immigrants and freedom of speech and religion. The FBI is investigating his campaign, and he faces scrutiny about whether his company is benefiting from his office. All of these issues could well become in front of and before the Supreme Court. It's more important now than ever before that we have a neutral, clear-minded justice sitting on the bench. After carefully considering all these issues, I cannot support Judge Gorsuch's confirmation. It is not an easy decision, but I believe it is the right one for our country. And with that, I yield the floor, Mr. President.